Hello and welcome. In this episode, we'll be covering mass shootings and I'll show you how you can find mass shooting statistics as well as how to analyze and make sense of them. Sometimes you'll run across a meme like this. This particular one's from Occupy Democrats back in early June, which claims a high number of mass shootings in the US, in this case, one mass shooting per day. And it's not limited to memes, you'll find news headlines with similar claims. The first and most important thing to understand about mass shooting statistics is that there is no standard or official definition of a mass shooting. The FBI has defined mass killings, but that's an entirely different concept, as we'll soon find out. So what that means is that you'll never see FBI statistics for mass shootings like you would for homicides or other violent crimes. So this means that different outlets can use different criteria, which can result in statistics that have massive discrepancies depending on which source you use. For example, in 2015, depending on which source you use, there could have either been 7, 65, or 332 mass shootings that year. So let's look at these different sources and see exactly what they are measuring. Traditionally, there have been three outlets which get cited for mass shooting data. The first is the Stanford Mass Shootings in America database, which was started back in 2012 in reaction to the mass shooting in Sandy Hook. This database defines mass shootings as events where there's 3 or more shooting victims, although not necessarily fatalities, and not including the shooter. And they do eliminate events which were identifiably gang, drug, or organized crime related. And in 2015, this was the middle estimate in those wide-ranging mass shooting statistics. So it reported 65 mass shootings in 2015. However, this database is currently expired. Apparently it took them too much resources to maintain, and it's not clear if it will ever come back. But going forward, it's not really being cited at all for current data, nor is it a particularly useful source at this time. So now we're left with just 2 mass shooting databases that are generally cited. Those are the Mother Jones Mass Shooting Database and the Gun Violence Archive Database. Each of these has very different methodology, which yields drastically different results between the two. So it's important to understand what each are telling us and how to interpret the data. Finding these databases is easy. You just type in mass shooting statistics in your search engine and just ignore anything that's not Mother Jones or Gun Violence Archive, as at best they're just going to be regurgitating the information found in those, as those are the primary sources. So if we go down just a little bit, the third result is the Mother Jones database, and the 5th result is for the Gun Violence Archive. So let's start with the Mother Jones database. For those who aren't familiar with Mother Jones, they are a left-wing media outlet with a pretty clear bias, but when it comes to mass shooting data, ironically, they're actually the most conservative and most restrictive database out there. In my opinion, this is the best mass shooting database, as it most accurately depicts events that most people would consider to be mass shootings. In a bit, we'll see that the Gun Violence Archive includes all sorts of events that most people wouldn't really consider to be mass shootings. And it has the added bonus of being a left-wing outlet, so when you cite it, you can't be accused of using right-wing or pro-gun sources. This database originally covered mass shootings from 1982 to 2012, but they've kept it up since then, so it continues to have a up-to-date tally of mass shootings, although they did change their methodology slightly after 2013, which we'll see here in a second. And with any mass shooting database, you want to understand the methodology from the outset so you understand what you're looking at. In this case, in order to find their methodology, you have to click on their Guide to Mass Shootings in America. That brings us to this page where we see that their database focuses on indiscriminate rampages in public places resulting in 4 or more victims killed by the attacker. And they exclude shootings stemming from more conventionally motivated crimes such as armed robbery or gang violence. And if we scroll down, we can see that they further clarify their methodology below. So to qualify as a mass shooting in the Mother Jones database, the perpetrator must kill at least 4 people, although this was changed to 3 people after 2013 because the US government changed their definition of a mass murderer from 4 to 3. So this is important because if we're trying to compare apples to apples from before 2013 and after, we need to keep in mind that in this database the threshold for mass killing was lowered. But if we're aware of this, we can omit any event that didn't have 4 deaths if we want to remain consistent, or just keep in mind what the new threshold is. Some other criteria they use is that the killings were carried out by a lone shooter, except in couple cases like Columbine, also that the shootings occurred in a public place. Again, with a couple exceptions, but they're trying to focus on events which had a public crowd. Perpetrators who died or were wounded during the attack were not included in the victim tallies, so again, that 3 or 4 fatality threshold doesn't include the shooter. And they also included a handful of cases known as spree killings, where the killings might have occurred in more than one location, but still over a short period of time and otherwise fit their criteria. Now that we understand the methodology, we can go ahead and look at the data. So if you scroll down, we'll see that they post an Excel file. This is their mass shooting database, and it breaks down each event into several different categories. Depending what you're investigating, many of these categories can be quite useful. For instance, it includes the location, date of the mass shooting, number of fatalities and injuries, as well as total victims. Location type, for instance, is it a workplace or school type shooting? Age of the perpetrator, were there prior signs of mental health issues? Weapons, were they obtained legally or not? Weapon type can be useful, as well as race and gender of the perpetrator, and they include sources where you can find information on each individual event. Latitude and longitude, probably not so useful. Type is, was it a mass shooting or spree shooting? And finally, the year that the shooting took place. The nice thing about this database is that you can sort each one of these categories. It defaults to list each mass shooting by date, beginning with the earliest one, so going back to 1982. But if we wanted to see the most recent mass shootings, click here and go sort Z through A, and then it'll list the most recent first, going backwards in time. So again, this is useful if we want to see, let's say, how many mass shootings have there been in 2019 so far, and we can see there is 7 according to this database. And most are pretty recognizable. For instance, we see the Dayton shooting, El Paso, Gilroy Garlic Festival, Virginia Beach, and most of those were covered pretty heavily in the news. You might not have heard of the Pennsylvania hotel bar shooting, but in general, a lot of these were pretty major incidents that most of us would indeed view as a mass shooting. And this will differ substantially when we go and look at the gun violence archive list. It can also be useful to filter some of the other categories. For instance, fatalities. If we wanted to see the worst mass shootings, we could sort Z through A. We could see which ones had the most deaths. Or if we go the other way, A through Z, we can see all the ones that just had 3 fatalities that were previously not considered mass shootings if we wanted to filter those out. It can also be useful to sort some of the other categories. For instance, if we want to see which weapons were obtained legally, we can sort that, and that allows us to quickly see which were and weren't. So you can see there's lots we can play around with here, lots of information that we can get depending on what you're looking for. And again, this is the database I think is best and most accurate when it comes to listing mass shootings, although unfortunately it's not used nearly as often as the Gun Violence Archive, which we'll cover next. The Gun Violence Archive is an outlet which compiles data on all sorts of different gun violence issues. It's not just limited to mass shootings. For example, they do school shootings, officer shootings, many different categories. But for this video, we're just going to focus on the mass shooting section. Just like with the other databases, we want to first look at the methodology so we can understand what we're looking at in regards to the data. So for that, we need to scroll all the way to the bottom. We see methodology. We'll go ahead and click on that. So this lists their general methodology. For example, we can see that their research involves over 6,500 sources, which come from local and state police, media, government, and other sources. And as it relates specifically to mass shootings, if we go scroll all the way towards the bottom, we can see their definition of a mass shooting is 4 or more shot and or killed in a single event at the same general time and location, not including the shooter. So this varies from the Mother Jones database in 2 significant ways. First, they include events where the victims could be shot or killed. If we remember the Mother Jones methodology, they only included events where 3 or 4 victims were killed, whereas the Gun Violence Archive methodology now, they could have a mass shooting where actually nobody died. The other major difference is that the Gun Violence Archive doesn't factor in the circumstances behind the shooting, so they're not going to eliminate anything that was a gang shooting or drug related or family massacre type situation. Any event where there's 4 or more shot and killed is included regardless of the circumstances. As you could probably guess, this methodology results in a much higher count of mass shootings than the other databases, and also includes things that a lot of people probably wouldn't consider to be mass shootings. They even acknowledge this above, where they address why the gun violence archive's numbers are higher than some other sources. They claim that they believe equal importance is given to counting of those injured as well as killed. In order to access the database, you go to Reports, and then you see the list of all the mass shooting databases. It goes back to 2014. So if you want to look at 2019, go ahead and click on that. This database defaults to showing you the most recent shootings first, and also includes state, city or county, the address, number of killed, number of injured, and then allows you to see a recap of the incident as well as the sources that they used. Each complete page lists 25 events, so once we know that, it makes it easier to calculate the total number of mass shootings, as for whatever reason they don't list them by number. So if we go to the bottom here, click on last, we see that currently there are 11 pages, so at 25 mass shootings per page, that would be 250 shootings plus however many are on the last page, and I already counted there are 24 on the last page, so that means a total of 274 mass shootings as of now for 2019 according to the Gun Violence Archive. This database doesn't give us quite as many tools as the Mother Jones as far as sifting through the data, but fortunately it does allow you to sort by each one of these categories. So let's say you wanted to sort by state, we could click on state. It would start with the A's. If you click it again, it would go the reverse order. So that's kind of nice if you want to see where these mass shootings were happening. Another good column to sort is the number killed. Go ahead and click on that. That starts listing all the events which resulted in no deaths, and there's kind of a surprising number of them. In fact, we have to go all the way to the 6th page in order to find our first death in a mass shooting in this database. So what that means is that 139 mass shootings resulted in 0 deaths so far. So that's slightly over half of all their mass shootings had 0 deaths, which would probably surprise most people. And that's sort of the story of the Gun Violence Archive in general. Once you start sifting through the data, looking at the actual events, you'll find the majority, probably the vast majority of these incidents are not what most people would view as a typical mass shooting. They tend to be gang violence, drive-by shootings, often fights at a party or bar late at night, things like that, not your traditional school or public mass shooting. For example, if we look at a specific event, let's take this shooting in Chicago, which had 0 fatalities and 4 injured, and we can see that it was a drive-by shooting. If you scroll to the bottom, you can look at the actual news story. We see that 4 were wounded in the shooting, which took place about 3:25 a.m. outside of a gas station. Someone in a gray or silver-colored sedan unleashed gunfire at the group, and no arrests have been reported. And this isn't some sort of outlier. This type of shooting makes up the bulk of the Gun Violence Archive. Instances where it appears to be gang-related or involved with some other crime. Generally, the suspect is never identified or even arrested. And this is also probably why you're not able to sort by the type of gun in these mass shootings, because most of these incidents, the gun and perpetrator are unknown. So in my opinion, the Gun Violence Archive is a rather poor measure of mass shootings in America because it equivocates the term. We generally hear the term mass shooting in relation to dramatic and tragic events in the news which have a distinct nature. And then when memes or news articles reference the mass shooting statistics, they include all sorts of events that typically aren't thought of as mass shootings. So basically the Gun Violence Archive is a better gauge of gang and drug violence than it is of the mass shootings that most of us think of. It's misleading, but you can see why so many outlets use the Gun Violence Archive database, as it shows a much higher amount of mass shootings. So to recap, we've learned that there are 2 primary mass shooting databases in use today. First is the Mother Jones database, which includes events where at least 3 people were killed, not including the shooter, and they remove things like gang shootings, drive-bys, family massacres, things that most people would identify as mass shootings. And according to that database, there's been 7 mass shootings so far in 2019. And then there was the Gun Violence Archive, which includes any events where there was at least 4 people shot or killed, and currently there are 274 mass shootings according to their methodology. So now when we go back to the meme that we started off with, it's pretty apparent where they get their numbers from, and we can understand the context behind them, what they say, and what they leave out. I'll include the links of the two databases in the video description, and I encourage all of you to go and check them out, spend some time playing around and seeing the different aspects of them. So next time you see a meme or news article like this, that you'll know right where to go to double check it and you'll understand the context behind it. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and until next time, so long.